Hi, my name's Chris and you're watching Font of Inspiration. Now, what would you say is the ideal length for a game session, specifically for tabletop RPGs? Is it 3 hours? Is it 4 hours? A whopping 8? Or maybe you can get by with just 1 or 2? Let's find out what works for you today. Okay, so you're planning your next or maybe even first tabletop role-playing game session, and you're not exactly sure how long it should take. Is there even such a thing as an ideal session length? Is there a one-size-fits-all answer? Well, there are at least 5 factors we could consider when trying to gauge some kind of session length. Why 5? Because I could think of 5 things. And the internet likes round numbers for some reason. I mean, if you think about it, the Journal of Consumer Research stated Consideration 1. Game genre. Firstly, consider the genre of the game you're about to run. Is it fantasy, horror, sci-fi, intrigue, something else? Are there any modes of play that are expected to fit within one game session? For example, in a game of D&D, should you try to incorporate the 3 main pillars of exploration, social interaction, and combat? Or in a game of Call of Cthulhu, should you try to make time for investigation and maybe an encounter with some kind of unspeakable cosmic horror? Now, naturally, there's no one true "this is how Game X should be run" every single time model out there. Now, don't get me wrong, you absolutely should know the basic thematic building blocks of the game you're about to run, or the system you're about to run, but you should feel free to discard any facets of the game that you or your group just don't find enjoyable. For example, if your group just isn't that into combat, you could run a game centered around a mystery or social interaction. On the other hand, if your group thinks that exploration is a chore, have the entire adventure take place in a single city. Boom, no exploration, problem solved. So be sure to always customize your games, both the single sessions and the adventure or larger campaign as a whole, to suit both the tastes of you and your players, while playing to the strengths of the game system itself. Consideration 2. Session frequency. Now, secondly, consider how often you run the game in question. Depending on how often you actually manage to run a game, trying to incorporate all of these very genre-specific elements and tropes into every session might not be feasible. It just might not be realistic, and it might not even be necessary. Supposing you manage to run a game every week, maybe it's fine to just have a session of the players crafting magic items or shopping, building a fortress, or maybe studying some ancient glyphs on a faraway planet somewhere. Now, that's all fine if you know that the next session is going to feature, for example, a significant threat that the sessions have been leading up to, or maybe the players are going to further the shared story in a more major way in the next session. But then again, if on the other hand you meet with your group, let's say every month or 2 months, you're probably more inclined to create a more balanced session with a lot of variety and most likely more action, just so that you make that session extra memorable. Now, that means there's quite a lot of pressure on that single session to tide your players over until the next time you meet. Consideration 3. Game environment. Thirdly, you should consider the type of environment you will be running the game in. Is it in person or is it online? Is it at a convention or is it with a home group? In-person games tend to be a little bit longer than online games because the participants have to often travel for a couple of hours perhaps to reach the place where they'll be playing the game, and in turn, of course, game masters want to make the trip feel worth it and give the players as much bang for their buck as possible. Just remember that more game doesn't always mean better game. In-person games tend to ease into the actual game a little bit slower than online games. Since when we meet in person, we tend to like to shoot the breeze for a little while and maybe catch up with what's going on in our personal lives, talk about the latest news in pop culture, and so on. So bear that in mind, and maybe you'd like to devote an hour or so just to talk for some friendly banter before the actual game starts. Online games, on the other hand, tend to get into the swing of things a little bit quicker. They don't involve any travel, which means you can probably devote a little more time to a single session than you would normally, because you don't have to factor in travel time. Or maybe you can run them for a little bit longer in the evening if you wish. If it happens that life gets in the way, it's quite a bit easier to take a break in the middle of an online session, or even reschedule the entire session for another day. Of course, you're not going to get the exact same in-person interaction as you would with an in-person game, and naturally that might be a deal breaker for some. Consideration 4. Pacing and flow. So fourthly, you should consider the pacing and flow of your session. Is your session as efficient as it could be? Are pacing and flow factors you and your players tend to value during a game? Or are all of you just mostly happy to be around each other and roll a few dice and talk about stuff? Now I'm guessing most groups fall somewhere in the middle here, where they don't want the game to drag too much, but on the other hand, they don't mind if there are a few lulls or moments of less action here or there. But if you find that your sessions drag on too long, or you just simply would like to accomplish more during a session, or maybe get to feature more of those modes of play that we talked about earlier, perhaps your session just isn't as efficient as it could be. Now, in several cases, depending of course on the game, the problem is that combat might be taking too long. Again, naturally this depends wildly on the game you play, since the structure of combat, the flow of combat, the length of a combat encounter varies quite a bit from game to game. Still, combat tends to be one of those more mechanics-based aspects of a game that can be quite easily bogged down by numbing encounters featuring hordes of enemies that sound good on paper, but turn out to be monotonous slugfests where each side just exchanges blows until, one side wins. Combat can also be bogged down by looking up rules too often, or maybe just good old-fashioned player indecision. The Angry DM and a YouTuber called Zipperon Disney touch on this topic of making combat flow better. So instead of just paraphrasing them, I'll put links to their work in the description so that you can check it out for yourself. Now I'm using combat here as an example, but by no means does combat have to be the bottleneck in the flow and pacing of your game. It could be that your riddles are just taking too long to solve, or that your players just don't know what to do next because you haven't given them any clear options. Whatever the case may be, check that you have good pacing and flow. Consideration 5. Personal preference. The fifth thing you should consider is what your personal ideal session length is. The previous points have steered you towards sort of optimizing your game in terms of session length, if there is such a thing as an optimal game session, with less regard for personal taste, while this final point is all about what you and the people playing with you consider fun. I would wholeheartedly suggest that you talk about this with your players, since you should definitely be aware if one of your players enjoys slow, massive dungeon crawls that span an all-nighter, and another player just simply cannot concentrate for more than 1 or 2 hours at a time. Now, this is not a dig at either of those players. We are all different when it comes to how long we can stay alert and invested in what we're doing. And it pays to know if there are any major discrepancies between players, if there are any major differences in preference. If one likes really short games and one likes really long games, you might have a problem over time. Talking about it is the first step towards mitigating the possible negative effects of that problem, if it is a problem. So what if you have players that enjoy wildly different session lengths? Well, you could consider structuring your sessions so that players who prefer a slower boil or a longer session can arrive earlier, and maybe take those 2 hours learning that ancient language, drafting a peace treaty between two warring factions, or building their own fortress. And the player who just wants a 1 to 2 hour, maybe max 3 hour burst of well-paced action or intense high-stakes drama and decision-making can arrive at the climax of that session. Sort of like all those superheroes at the end of Avengers Endgame, or maybe Han Solo at the end of Star Wars. Now, this type of session might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it's something you can do if you have players that want different things in terms of session length. Okay, so now we've covered my top 5 considerations for planning session length. My personal experience has been that I enjoy a mix of both online games and in-person games. But I've also found that online games grant me this nice degree of flexibility when it comes to session length. For example, my home group's last session, which took place online, took 4 hours, and involved the adventurers making a final supply run in town, navigating their way into a forest, just managing to run away from a hydra living in a lake, ouch, and finally making 2 quite lengthy attacks on a keep, which they managed to take in the end. Yay! Now, instead of trying to cram looting the keep, interrogating any possible prisoners, and planning the next move, I just called the session as soon as the leader of the bad guys had been captured, and decided that our next session would be a short one of maybe just 2 hours, where the players unpack what happened previously, before setting off on the next part of their adventure. This kind of very short session is great for downtime activities as well. There's a great Matt Colville video on this topic, so naturally I'll be adding that to the description as well. My point with this anecdote was that you can have sessions of different length depending on what you want to achieve. Just remember that the shorter you want the sessions to be, the more confident with their knowledge of the system and the rules you and your players need to be. Unless you're running maybe a really rules-light type of game where you don't really need to worry about that kind of thing. Personally, I tend to have enough energy for about a 3-hour session. Maybe 4. If there's a lunch break in the middle or a dinner break, I could go on for 5. As a player, I tend to have energy for longer sessions because there's less cognitive load when you're playing as opposed to when you're GMing. You have all those balls you're juggling in the air when you are running a game versus focusing on just the character that you're playing. If the specific game, the rule set that you're using, that you're playing, if it's D&D, Call of Cthulhu, Legend of the Five Rings, Fate, Fiasco, whatever, if there is a suggested game length, try it out. If it's 3 or 4 hours, as I would say 4 hours is probably the suggested length for a D&D game, go ahead and try it out. See how it fits for your group, and then adjust accordingly, depending on whether you would like to play for longer or for shorter amounts of time. But in the end, you need to find out what works for you and what works for the game that you're running. Depending on genre of the game, the environment you play in, how often you play, the pacing and flow of your game, and what you and your group's personal preferences are. So be mindful of how long you and your group generally take to overcome challenges and move on in the story. And then adjust your game accordingly. This might sound fairly obvious, but often we forget to take a step back and look at our games and how we run them and how long they take and what we actually do within a single session. Because if we don't keep an eye on what we actually end up doing in a session, not the stuff that we plan before the session that we would like to have done by the end of the session, but what we actually end up doing, we run the risk of never learning how to improve. It's one thing to get a sense, to get a feel for an adventure as it is on the page, but it's a completely different beast to actually run the game and find out that, oh, okay, this thing that was supposed to take 5 minutes as it's written actually took 2 hours. Another thing you can do, if your players are up for it, if they're willing, and you're willing, is to record the sessions. Purely for yourself, of course. I mean, if your players are into streaming your sessions and you're into it as well, then, have at it. But just recording a session or 2 for yourself can do wonders for getting a sense of what it looks like from an outsider perspective. And that way you can study the pacing of your games. So, how do you determine session length? Do you have a tried and true formula that works every time? Or do you change things up depending on the circumstances? Let me know in the comments. If you found this video useful, I would appreciate a like. It lets me know that you would like to see more of this kind of thing in the future. In any case, thanks for watching. Happy gaming!